Hello and welcome to KP's Watches. Today we have a Rolex 1603 to take a look at. This model is a stainless steel only model. It's This one in particular is from 1978, and this video is just for you to take a good look at what the watch looks like if you're in the market of buying one. You know, sometimes pictures can be a bit difficult to get a good understanding of what the watch looks like, so maybe you want a video format instead, and I'll just go through the features of the watch. And I was thinking we could go through some of the tips for buying one of these, maybe what you should look out for. So first things first, let's talk about the case. The case itself is stainless steel. The bezel is stainless steel in this model. If you get the fluted bezels, they're made of precious metals, so either yellow gold or white gold, but in this case stainless steel, because this is the engine turned version. And this particular watch is on the Jubilee bracelet. I'm not sure if you can get it on the Oyster bracelet, the vintage ones, but the Jubilee is the most common, I believe. This one in particular is the solid sort of side links. So this has solid D links and then hollow center links. You can get the ones with folded metal sort of links, or you can get the oval shape links. So depends on what you get. You know, those ones are slightly lighter. This one's a slightly heavier bracelet, and it's one of the more modern bracelets. And you have the typical vintage Rolex clasp here. If we just go ahead and unbuckle this, you have the stampings on the inside and a bit of inscription on the numbers behind. And the back of this watch has, you know, the classic Rolex case back. So usually they aren't marked or inscribed with anything. You can have people sort of engrave that, but usually it's just brushed metal. And you have these end links there, 555. So that's the number inscribed on them. So this watch, as I mentioned, has a 36 millimeter case. It has 20 millimeters a lug width. So what that means is that if you're going to buy a strap for this watch, you want to get it with 20 millimeter sizing. And this is an automatic watch, so that means it winds itself. It's mechanical, and if you put it down for a couple of days, it will stop. Now, the crystal is made of acrylic on these watches, so that means that if you hit it against metal, for example, you will scratch the crystal, but they aren't very easy to scratch. To get a deep scratch, rather, you have to really hit it hard. It's possible, but the benefit is that they can be polished, and they can also be replaced quite cheaply because they're made of plastic rather than sapphire. So that's something to keep in mind. And the water resistance of this watch, I would recommend you don't bring vintage watches anywhere close to water. This one in particular has new seals and has been tested to 20 meters and is fine, but we would still never ever bring it next to water. We'd say you can wear it. If you unluckily get some water on it, it will be fine, but no submerging, for example. Now, something that I want to talk about was sort of things to keep out for when buying vintage watches like this Rolex itself. So let's start with the hands. So the hands on Rolexes haven't changed for a very long time. The vintage watches tend to have a couple of different hand variations. So you have Dauphine hands and you have sort of leaf spring hands, and these ones are the common type, which is just sort of two bevels, one on each side. And something to really keep in mind is that seconds hand. Now, the seconds hand on Rolexes are very, very well manufactured. If you sort of see if we can get it to focus up close here, you want to be careful with the seconds hand. There, it has a very specific profile you want to look into. The vintage watches from 1970s, 1960s, they either have this sort of slightly thicker sort of counterweight and pointer, and there are some with a very thin counterweight and pointer, and it depends on what you like. This is more like the modern sort of seconds hands, but keep that in mind. It's something that you don't notice until you really look into the watch. And with the seconds hands, you always want to look at the lume. So these watches have a tritium lume on them, and what that means is that it is made of a special compound, radioactive compound. It's safe to wear, but they stop glowing maybe 5-10 years after they've been put on the watch. And so you want to just make sure that that lume does not glow when you get the watch, because that tells you that it's been relumed, if you care about that sort of thing. A lot of collectors care about them not being relumed. And the lume tends to darken with time or age, and it gets this little patina. Here you can see a few sort of spots in the lume. That's just patina. And yeah, so that's just something to watch out for with the hands. Another thing is that they tend to have little marks on them from servicing, but that's sort of inevitable. It's very rare that you find sort of vintage watches with perfect hands. So just keep that in mind. The next thing you may want to take a look at, that's very important, is the dial itself. So these dials tend to have a step in them, the vintage watches from the 1960s, 1970s. So here you can see that they have just a quick step there between the two. So it's a sunburst finish here, and then a sort of a flat finish. There isn't a sort of a graining or anything to it. So if you see a dial with a circular graining, for example, that it could hint towards it being repainted or refinished, and that's an important thing to note. Repainted dials are essentially dials that have been taken out and repainted because they had corrosion on them. That really significantly diminishes the value of the watch, so you want to look out for that. Another thing you may want to look out for is hour indices. So you want to make sure that those hour indices are genuine and from Rolex. So maybe take a look at photos and see if you can find another example. And chances are, if there is more than one of them, then it's most likely a Rolex watch dial. So we should be fine there. Next thing you may want to take a look at is the bezel. So whenever you're buying watches, especially if you're buying them on auctions, you want to make sure that there are no cracks in the bezel. So you want to look all the way around in photos and ensure that the bezel has no lines or cracks that deviate from the regular design. It's a lot harder on these watches, but it is still possible with good photos and details. Always ask for photos. And another thing you may want to take a look at is the condition of the case edges. So a lot of times with age, Rolex watches sort of lose their edge. Now, it's not a bad thing, because you can quite often fix that with a bit of polishing and refinishing. But you just want to keep into mind that you don't want the edges to be too over polished, because sometimes they become too thin and it just ruins the look of the watch. So that's another thing you might want to keep in mind. You also want to take a look at the crown threads on these watches. So here, if I just go ahead and unscrew the crown to its winding position, there's a little thread there on the crown, sort of threads in. You want to ensure that that thread works properly and hasn't been sort of ruined over time by accidentally threading it the wrong way or cross threading. So take a look at that. Let me just go ahead and unscrew this and just tell you how the setting on this watch works. So this watch has two positions. It does not have a quick set. So if you get any of the vintage watches with the 1570 movement in it, then there is no quick set, which means that in the first position, it simply winds. And in the second position, it sets the time. And so if you want to change over to, let's say, the fourth, for example, you're going to have to go through the whole 24 hours like this. And I'll just show you the rapid set, also the rapid date change. So here with vintage Rolexes, all the way back to the 1960s, they had an instantaneous date change. So here, if I go up to about midnight, bam, it snaps over. And it changed instantly there. I don't know if you noticed that. It didn't crawl over, and that's sort of a very, very beautiful feature of this watch itself. But for all that advancement, there isn't a quick set. So it does mean that, let's say you want to get to the 20th, you have to go through the full 24 hours, another 16 times, which is a bit of an issue. If you have the patience, or you're going to wear this quite often, there's not an issue with that. So let me just go ahead and screw that back in. And that's that. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. I'd like to ask you to sort of like and subscribe if you found this useful and you're interested in looking at possibly more reviews upcoming in the future. Thank you for your time, and I hope you have a great day.